The key to living a harmonious life is knowing your values, aligning your behavior to your values, and considering how your choices will affect people and situations that are important in your life. There may not always be an easy way when it comes to making tough choices in life, but there is always a way. To not choose is a choice to allow circumstances to choose for you, which is disempowering. Own your choices and you own your life. We often face situations where we have to make difficult decisions that seem to pull us in opposite directions, leaving us feeling torn and uncertain about which path to choose. These conflicting choices can be related to our career, relationships, personal growth, or any other aspects of our lives. It's natural to feel overwhelmed and anxious when faced with such dilemmas. But what if we could find a way to navigate them with a sense of harmony and balance? So, today I'm going to share some practical tips and strategies to help you make more conscious and empowering decisions. We're going to dive deep into the root causes of these conflicting choices and what influences our decision making process. So, if you're someone who's struggling to make a tough decision or feeling overwhelmed by conflicting choices, you're in the right place. By the end of this, you'll have a much better understanding of how to find harmony amidst conflicting choices and make decisions that align with your values, your goals, and your vision for your life. So let's get started. Some of you might be saying, I don't have a vision for my life. What's he talking about? So I cover this in a previous lives, actually more than one. So I recommend following the numbers on where you see in the thumbnails where it says which day we're doing, and then looking at the titles and seeing if you missed the one on vision. It's super, super important. Of course, I talk a lot about values, and most of these lives, you're going to want to know as much as you possibly can about values, especially as it comes to making decisions and choices, because whether you are aware of it or not, every choice and every decision you have ever made was driven by a value. It was driven by an intention. More specifically, the fulfillment of an intention or the fulfillment of a value. Intention and value are synonymous in this context that we're discussing it. Most of us, though, are making those choices and those decisions unconsciously, meaning you're leaving it up to your unconscious. And just because it's unconscious does not mean that it's not driven by a value or an intention. It absolutely is. And this is why we get into these sort of autopilot choices and autopilot decisions. And we need to do that. We need to set things on autopilot because we can't constantly be redeciding like absolutely everything. If you think about what you do when you get up in the morning, most of that's on autopilot. Whatever your morning routine is. Some people say, "Well, I don't have a morning routine." Yes, you do. Pretty much everything that you do in the morning, it doesn't change that much. And sometimes that's a really good thing. But sometimes when you've been doing the same things based on the same choices over a period of years, you kind of just slip so far into unconsciousness that you've completely forgotten why you're doing what you're doing. And then suddenly you're faced with a dilemma. And you're often wondering, how did I even get here? How did I get myself into this situation? And that's where more conscious living, more mindfulness becomes a real benefit in your life for growth. Now, before I get into the actual practical tips that you can apply, I want you to think of two metaphors that I like to use when it comes to making tough choices. One is if you can imagine a battlefield, and a battlefield often is what it feels like inside of us when we're faced with tough choices. You feel like one side is wanting one thing and another side is wanting another thing, and you go back and forth, and it can turn into a conflict. What if you were to rise up above that, like a bird's eye view, go higher and higher and higher until you have this overall picture of what's going on? And when I think about a battlefield, and if you're down on the ground, you typically have chosen one side to root for, or that you're maybe fighting on one side. And then when you rise up high enough and you look down and you see these small humans killing each other, fighting, hurting each other, and you think of from that perspective of humanity, and you think, why do we do this to ourselves? Aren't we all just kind of wanting the same thing? And so we can think about ourselves that way when we're faced with a tough choice and we feel conflicted inside and we feel like we're at war with ourselves. We can take a step back and look at ourselves and say, all parts of me, everything that's going on inside of me, we all really want the same thing. We want to be happy. We want to be fulfilled. So, coming at it from that perspective, how can I use that to make better choices, especially if it's something very specific? Another metaphor I like to think about whenever I'm faced with a tough choice, the bottom of the ocean is always very, very calm unless something unnatural disturbs it, of course. Even when storms on the surface of the ocean are raging, think about like the worst storms. If you go deep enough to the bottom of the ocean, hundreds and hundreds of feet down, there's peace and serenity. And sometimes when I'm meditating, I'll imagine myself at the bottom of the ocean like that, where there's just absolute peace and serenity. It doesn't matter how much the storm is raging at the surface. Deep within you, deep within you, there's always peace. And you can access that peace. It might take some meditation, it might take some getting very quiet with yourself, risking feeling bored, the worst thing that we can think of, right? But you can always connect with that deep, deep inner peace inside of you. And it's such a better place to make choices and make decisions from when you're coming from that deep inner peace. Now, there's reasons why we really struggle to access that deep inner peace within us. And I'll go into why that is. As I was preparing this live for today, more and more information started coming out. I was like, well, I could talk about this and I could talk about that. At a certain point, I had to sort of cut it off because this is going to go too long. But I'm going to try to get in as much as possible. So, how did you get to where you are now? Wherever you are in life, how did you get? What's holding this in place, your life as it is right now? Now, we could say beliefs, and we've covered that already. And that's something else I could probably talk endlessly about. But we're going to go more specifically to decisions and choices. Your life, whatever you feel about your life right now, what got you here is the choices you've made and the choices you continue to make. If you want something different than what you're getting, all you have to do is make different choices. And I know that sounds overly simplified, but let's not ignore or overlook this absolute truth. You make different decisions than you're making now, your life has to change. So why don't we just do that? Because for most of us, that's extremely scary. What if you make a choice and now your life is worse than what it was before? That's what we're so afraid of, isn't it? We would rather continue making the same choices, maintain the status quo, As long as I'm familiar with that and I know what it is, because that's not scary. Even if I don't like it, at least it's not scary. We're so afraid of the unknown. We're so afraid of what might happen that we don't know, that it keeps us in this one place. And this is where indecision ultimately comes from. But you have to understand that indecision is a choice when you don't make a choice, as I mentioned earlier. So let's talk about congruence. Congruence. What is congruence? I actually have a definition for it. Agreement or harmony, compatibility. We use congruence a lot in neuro linguistic programming. We want to make sure we are congruent with our choices. We want to make sure we are congruent with goals and outcomes that we set. Because if we're not, then we invite resistance. Or if there's something we want to do and we experience some resistance to that, we want to address that. And it's not to say stay congruent so that therefore you don't do anything. And that's kind of what most of us are doing already, where we're stuck in a place in life we're not exactly happy with. But for the most part, we're congruent with that. That's why we maintain it. And then we say, well, I could go try this other thing. Wow, that's really scary. And therefore, I'm not quite congruent with that. Or I want to try this thing, but I'm afraid it might anger other people. Or I'm afraid people might think that I'm stepping out of who they think that I am. And then if I do that, maybe they won't want to be my friend anymore. Or maybe they won't want to connect with me anymore. So maybe I'll lose my friends. Maybe I'll lose my family because they won't recognize me anymore. This was a huge struggle that I had once whenever it was shortly after I'd moved to Los Angeles, left my parents behind and my immediate family up to that point. And I was doing a lot of meditation and a lot of yoga and a lot of thinking of my life, reflecting on it, and a lot of writing. And I was meditating once and I started to feel like I was dying. And I could feel that was holding on to like my family members. I like had a sense of them being inside of me. I was clinging to them, holding on to them. And upon that realization, that whole thing was sort of dissipating. I was seeing the illusion of that, which made me feel like I was dying because I had identified so strongly with them. And once it went up kind of in smoke, that's actually a kind of a metaphor that I was actually witnessing. And it was scaring me because I thought, well, once this happens, I'm going to disappear. And then it all went up. And suddenly I felt really light. And I realized what my greatest fear was. As I'm growing, as I'm evolving, what if I become unrecognizable to the people who love and care about me? Now, you might be saying, well, I don't have that problem. But I think deep down, we all have that fear. What if we become all that we could be, all that our potential is calling us to be? That can be really scary because maybe we turn out to be someone we didn't realize we are. And even worse, what if people around me don't recognize me and don't love me anymore? Even though I've become exactly who I want to be and I'm fulfilling my potential and all those things are good and I'm very, very successful, what if I lose everything else? We're so afraid of losing things with every choice that we make. So I took a big risk in my mind, or for me, and probably for a different video, I can go into how that actually my worst fears came true in a lot of ways about becoming more and more unrecognizable to people who love and care about me. And if you ask me, do I regret that choice? Absolutely not. And I can't make that choice for all of you and say that it's always the right thing to do. You have to find that in that truth for yourself. But for me, it was the right thing to do. So congruence, has to do with whether or not your decisions, your actions align with your values. When you're incongruent is when you're violating at least one value. You're going against yourself in some sort of way. But this is always flexible and this is always changeable. And I'm going to use an extreme example to demonstrate this. I am against killing. I am against killing human beings. I don't believe in the death penalty. Um, I hate war. Uh, I'm not 100% vegan, but I'm pretty close. I hate to think of animals in pain. I hate to think of. I have a hard time killing even a spider. Most of the time, I just brush it out of my house, and I hate spiders. But this has a lot to do with context, what we're congruent with and what we're not congruent with. So I hate killing, but if you dropped me into a war zone and handed me a gun and said, "Those people coming over the hill want to kill you," my feelings about killing might change for the very sake of my own survival. So when we think about what we're congruent with and what we're not congruent with, understand that this is always flexible and often context specific. And so when we think of just in our life decisions, sometimes it's too hard to understand in the scope of your entire life what is the right decision to make. So sometimes you have to bring it to a smaller context and say, within this context, what is the best choice? Chunking down the context makes things more understandable, more bite-sized. And this is why I recommend that you understand your values in the context in which they're elicited. For example, I always recommend chunking down your life into 3 to 5 major life contexts. That could be your career, your marriage, a hobby, parenthood, social life, whatever, try to keep it within no more than 5 contexts. And then in each one, ask yourself, what do you want? And elicit your values out of each one. And you'll make incredibly good decisions once you know what your values are and once you know what the hierarchy of those values are. Hierarchy is when you go through the values and you say, okay, you start comparing them out of this value and that value. If I could only have one in this situation, which one would I choose? And so you create a hierarchy of those values. And it's always specific to that particular context. You want to make sure that they're specific to that context because if I say, okay, I list my values of what I want in a career and I do the hierarchy of them, if when I go to do the hierarchy, if I start comparing the values and I'm not keeping it specific to the context of my career, my mind will start to wander into other areas of my life and I'll start thinking, well, freedom is really important to me in my career or really important to me of the work I do. But in my marriage, wow, love is, that love is maybe more important than freedom. And so your mind starts to wander. So you've got to contextualize this. It'll be, it's too messy if it's not. Another example of this is I'm going to buy a car. And by the way, I would never recommend buying a car at a dealership and negotiating everything at the dealership. There's a much better way to do this. And that's maybe another discussion for another video, but make sure I would work all the details out on the phone. The reason why is because when you step into a dealership, you're in the shark's water, basically. And they're just going to descend on you and pick you apart until they're going to try to go really high so that they move you to the middle ground. It's the way that they do things. So I negotiate everything when I buy a car. I negotiate everything on the phone first or by email. So you want to be very clear about what you're looking for when you're buying a car. It's probably the second biggest purchase that you make. So you want to be clear what's important. Is luxury important? Cost. Are you trying to keep your costs down? Fuel efficiency, safety. So let's just go with those 4. So if I walk into a dealership, which I said is a wrong thing to do, but you walk into a dealership and you're not clear on the hierarchy of those values of luxury, safety, cost, and fuel efficiency, that dealer is gonna start showing you all these cars, and what is he or she going to do? They're gonna try to get you to spend the most amount of money and really sell you on the fanciness of it and the luxury, and maybe luxury is important to you, but safety and fuel efficiency might be more important. But if you don't understand that hierarchy in your mind first, if you haven't cleared that up, it's so easy to get distracted by the flashy, shiny stuff, in which case you start to feel pulled apart. Well, I like this, and I also like this. If you had understood the hierarchy of your values in that situation, what you were looking for, and the clarity of that, then you would start at the top and say, okay, does it have this? Does it have this? Does it have this? And you would be able to make a choice based on your most important values to your least important values of what you're looking for in a car. Most people don't do this. And so they're able to be distracted by the dealer, and they end up paying for something they don't really want. I mean, it does to a certain extent meet their values, but not fully. I also recommend any type of negotiation, you know what you want to pay and not a penny more. And so when you walk into a situation like that and you're very clear, it doesn't matter how whoever you're negotiating with, whatever they're throwing at you to distract you, you're undistracted. You go, no, this is what I'm willing to pay. And you can stick to that and say that, okay, if you're going to try to get me to pay more, I'm done. I'm out of here. And of course, they're going to relent. You got to make sure, though, you absolutely know where your threshold is. So it's clarity. It's about knowing before you go into the situation. But most of us are not living life like that. We're going through it day to day, not clear about what our values are, not clear about what the hierarchy of those values are. So when we're faced with a decision, something different happens in our day than what is expected, and the autopilot has, is stopped because you have to make a new decision. If you don't understand your values and you don't understand the hierarchy of your values as it relates to that particular situation, you feel stuck and you go, I don't know. I don't know what to do. So you don't want to get stuck in those situations. You want to know these things ahead of time. However, if you do get stuck like that and you haven't thought about this ahead of time, you can take 5 minutes for yourself to sort this out. Elicit your values behind it. What do I want? What is important to me here? Decision A, what will this do for me? Decision B, what will this do for me? And go deep with both of them. So resistance is about congruence, when you're incongruent with something. And what we want to do is we want to own that resistance, not push it away, not repress it. Find out what is the value that the resistance is trying to get at, because you need to integrate that value into your choice. Then there's ecology. Ecology is sort of like external congruence. Ecology is, how does a particular choice or decision affect external systems around me? And when I say systems, in most cases, this will be relationships. So if you think about the word ecology and you think about like the ecosystem, if you take a species from one ecosystem, and people have done this throughout history, thinking that they could solve a problem because a certain species in one ecosystem does something that might solve a problem in another ecosystem. So they bring that species over, drop it into that ecosystem, and then they discover that it does solve that particular problem, but it creates a new problem. So we want to think in terms of ecology around us, the same thing. By making a particular choice, it gives me something that I want, but how does it affect other things in the ecosystem in which I live in? I'll give you a good example of this. It wasn't one of my clients, but a coach told me about this, that there was a woman who wanted to lose weight, and actually she was pretty good at it. She could drop weight pretty quickly, but she kept putting it back on. And so when the coach went deep enough with her, he realized that there was an ecology problem here. Every time she lost weight, other men started paying her more attention, and this upset her husband and made him very, very jealous. And so she kept putting the weight back on because she didn't want to upset her husband. She didn't wasn't aware of this consciously until the coaching. And I've actually worked with people on weight loss before, and some of them are afraid that if they lose weight and they change their eating habits, their friends who they hang out with, who eat really poorly and are overweight, that they'll stop being their friend. They won't accept them anymore because now they look different and eat differently. So you want to understand how ecology is often unconsciously affecting us. We can make it conscious and then we can say, okay, first of all, I understand the risk. And in understanding that, can I somehow mitigate this? Can I talk this through with this other person? You can see this happening in careers where people, if you get what happens if you get promoted and your friends who were at the same level as you, now you're in a position above them and you're making more money. How does that affect your relationships with them? And some people keep themselves small because they don't want to disturb ecology. And most of the time, they don't even realize that's what they're doing. And then at the same time, they complain that they're not advancing, they're not getting further or ahead in life. So much of this gets so much easier once you simply have the clarity of what is going on, your congruence, your ecology. Just knowing these things, understanding it, and having that clarity doesn't always make the decision easy, but it often makes the right decision clear and lets you know, in fact, what you need to do. People who are very decisive. They seem very confident. They seem very settled in with what choices they've made. And the reason for that is clarity and certainty. It's obvious to them. I talked about this in a previous live where I was in a situation where there were 3 people in addition to myself involved in this situation. All 3 of them wanted me to do something in particular. And there was no way I could make a choice without pissing off one of them. One of them was going to be upset with me, and possibly this could destroy our relationship. Now, if I was only focused on pleasing everyone, this is quite a dilemma because there was no possible way I could please everyone. So I had to turn to my own values and ask myself, what is the decision that I'm going to be happiest with? What is the decision that I can live with myself making, even if it destroys one of these relationships? What is the decision that I can go to bed at night and sleep well knowing that I made the best possible decision that I could have made? And what is that decision that I can wake up tomorrow morning and look at myself in the mirror and be okay and say, "Yeah, I made the right choice." And that could only come from knowing what your personal values are. So I was doing a lot of this work at the time, thankfully. Was very clear about my values, and I made a choice. And by the way, it's very likely if I didn't understand this stuff that I wouldn't have made a choice at all, which there's that indecision. Circumstances would have made my choice for me because this was time specific. I had to do something by a certain time. And if I had done nothing, that would have been a choice. And I would have probably ended up pissing off 2 people instead of 1. But I made a choice. And sure enough, there was one particular person got very angry with me and that relationship ended. And I was okay with that. I wasn't happy about the relationship ending, but I was okay because I knew I made the right choice. And then later found out that that person who got upset with me actually had an ulterior motive with me. Now, it won't always happen, and things won't always work out so well in every tough choice that you have to make. But make the choice that's going to align with your values. Make sure you address any resistance. Do your due diligence, information gather. And once you have all that and you know you're making the right choice, Even if it's tough, even if you stand to lose something, you'll still be okay because you know you made the right choice. And even if it doesn't work out, you're not psychic. You couldn't have foreseen the future, but you're making the right choice when it's the choice that aligns with your values. Now, if you've seen my video on resistance, this is very similar. When you have to make a tough choice, you can put those two choices out in front of you. I like to write things down. So I'd put choice A, choice B, and if there's a choice C, go ahead and put that out there too. And elicit the values of each choice. If I do this choice, choice A, what would that do for me? And elicit the values of that. Then go to choice B and say, if I choose this one, what does this do for me? And then do the same for choice C. Going deep into your values, I want you to think about as rising above the battlefield. Or if you like the other analogy of going to the bottom of the ocean where it's peaceful and serene, it's the same thing. When you dive into your values, you're getting outside of the individual choices, the strategies, the goals, you're going much higher. And when you hit the level of values, because values are what we call nominalizations, they're very vague, meaning they have many, many possibilities. They're not so specific that you're locked into doing something one way, like happiness as a value. There are many ways to be happy, many possibilities, most of which you haven't even discovered yet. So values bring you to the level of possibility, and they get you out of the stuckness of either or. When you elicit the values of each choice, you will see that once you get high enough, there are many overlapping values. Values like freedom, happiness, joy, peace, passion. And you'll start to discover that each choice contains many, many very high level values. And then when you can start to see how all of these values start to overlap over the multiple choices, then you start to see how you can get these values fulfilled. And then once you hit that level, then you can look down at the choices and say, okay, which one of these choices aligns with the majority of my highest values? And even better, if you have done a hierarchy of those values, then you know which ones are the most important ones. So then you can ask yourself, of these choices, which one is the most important to me? Which values do I need to get checked off first? And which choice aligns with those top values? It's rare that you can get all your values met off of one choice. But if you can get the highest ones, whichever choice you can get the highest ones met, that's going to be the best choice to make, obviously. And this becomes super, super clear. So you don't doubt it or question it anymore. Now, if you're wondering about this process and it sounds like I'm uh, not giving enough specific examples, there is a process that I've written out, and I believe it's in the description of this video. I didn't check it. If it's not now, I'll make sure we put it in there, but it should be in there. If you check the description right underneath the video, if you're watching this on YouTube, that process should be available. If you're watching this through Facebook, it should be above the video. It's just you click a link, and you'll get access to I believe it's a PDF. Like I said, if it's not there now, I'll put it there. So much of our indecision and most of our bad decisions have to do with trying to protect our sense of self. Now, notice I didn't say trying to protect ourselves, our sense of self. Because if you look at most of these choices that are in front of you, there's not probably any one of them that would completely destroy your life and destroy you physically or destroy something in your life that would be irreversible. I mean, it's possible. We do people do have to make such decisions in their life at some point. But most of your choices, most of your decisions, the ones that you're stressing over, even if you made the wrong choice, it probably wouldn't harm you physically, and it probably wouldn't, like, make you lose all your money and, have to start over. But even if you lost all your money, there's so many cases of people where they have lost all their money and they were able to come back. So it's very hard, in other words, to make a choice that would just completely destroy our lives, that we couldn't come back from. But because we don't really explore this and we don't really think it through, that's the feeling that we get. And we don't really unpack this and look at the truth of, like, that it's not really that the stakes are not as high as you think they are. But we're still functioning with that pressure and that burden of that stress as if it is. And that's not helping you. And so when I say sense of self, what I'm saying about this is we think about, what if I make this choice and it goes wrong, then I'm a failure. I'm a loser. I don't have my value or my worth will go down. That's the sort of implicit and unconscious things that we often think about when it comes to making a tough choice. So we just go, okay, well, I'm not going to make that choice. I'm going to sit and think about it, which is really just stalling. But if we start to examine this and we say, okay, what's the worst that could happen here? If I made the worst choice, the worst decision, what's the worst that could happen here? And if it has anything to do with self-worth, that's imaginary. There's no such thing as self-worth. If it can't be measured, if you can't measure the worth of something, then it doesn't exist, right? There's no way to measure your worth. It's an imaginary thing. The feeling feels real. I get that. And I'll cover this more on a later live about how to deal with that. So if your decisions are based on trying to protect an imaginary concept, like your value, your worth, any of those things, that's a good reason not to go with that choice. Or if it's creating the indecision, that's not a good enough reason not to make a choice. Because what you're protecting is something that's not real. You will be fine. There's no such thing as a person who is a failure. Failing is something that happens. It's not permanent, and it doesn't characterize who you are. So I'll give you one more thing that I like to use when I've had to make tough choices, and it works incredibly well, and it's incredibly simple. If you're faced with a tough choice, I want you to go out many years and imagine you are lying on your deathbed, reflecting on your life, all the good and all the bad, all the things you wish you had done, all the things that you wish you hadn't. And then ask yourself, what would you wish you had done with whatever the decision is that you're contemplating? So often when I've done this exercise, I realize either that while I'm lying on my deathbed and looking over my life, the decision or the choice seems so inconsequential to think that I ever made such a big deal out of it, that I was not sure what to do, or that I was wasting time stalling, trying not to make a decision. When I come from that perspective of being at the end of my life and looking back on this, it's a lot of times it's laughable. I'm like, what does it really matter? Just make a choice. And the other thing that I often think of, if it's a choice about doing something or not doing something, if I'm coming from that perspective of the last day of my life, almost always I think to myself, I'd rather do something than not do something. And they've done studies about this where people at the end of their life regret more the things they didn't do than the things that they did. I mean, they regret more the things they didn't do rather than the things that they did. Why? Because when we make a mistake, it doesn't stick around for very long most of the time. It gets forgotten. You move on, especially if you learn from it. I've done a live about that, about learning from your mistakes and how to really move on. It's not that big of a deal. But in our mind, in the moment, in the present, we keep thinking that that somehow downgrades our value, downgrades our worth every time we make a mistake. And it just doesn't. You'll be the same. Everything will be fine. So when you're faced with a tough choice, go out to the end of your life and look back and say, okay, would I rather do this or not do this? And you'll see. It helps you really put things in perspective. All right. What was your big takeaway from this? I want to say one more time too. If that PDF is not available in the description of this video at this moment, I will make sure that it is, because there's a whole process to this. What was your big takeaway? Write it down. It'll help you remember it, and even better if you share it with everyone here. I usually have a conclusion to these videos. I don't for this one. I had a lot to say, and I was trying to get it out as fast as I could. I will take a moment, though, right now and go over any questions that any of you have. Ellen says, Tangier, Morocco. Wow. Awesome. Morocco has been on my list for a while. Well, my wife's been talking about going for a while, so it's going to happen sooner or later. Brew in the morning first thing. Cool. People fight over limited resources in a zero-sum game, or at least that is the mindset that creates the battle. Yep. Hey, Damon, you know how there is a pattern for resolving grief, phobia cure, and other NLP patterns for other problems. How about a pattern for self-importance? Can we map that over to resources? That's interesting. A pattern for self-importance. I'd have to put some thought to that, because self-importance is at a very high logical level. It's very broad and vague. Let me think about that one. That's an interesting request. Your love of life is beautiful, Damon. Thank you. Very brave of you to be so authentic with it. I too have trouble killing even insects. I'll try to relocate, but have trouble with brown recluses, black widows. I know how you feel. I really don't like spiders. I actually like snakes a lot, and people find that strange. I really don't like spiders, but I really try to not kill them. I try to scoop them up with a piece of paper and just put them outside. All right. I value underdogs. What true value is attached to this? I need to add it to my list of values, but underdogs don't seem right. Well, I think that's natural for us to, it's you even think about the story of David and Goliath. We like the idea that a weaker um, opponent, or what have you, whatever the situation is, can overcome the odds and succeed. It's the hero's journey. Sounds like compassion to me. Okay, so let's see. A few years ago, they tried to sell me on a 2019 model of my 2017 SUV. When I went through the features of the car, they were literally the same car, just a newer model. Yeah. In Florida, they had a carnivorous slug that predated on, oh, was a predatory, or predated on another slug that was beneficial. So they import another kind of carnivorous predatory slug to eat the carnivorous slugs. The new slugs found the good slugs super delicious, so the problem was compounded. Yeah. Ecosystems, right? Loving this information. Decisive is one of my ambiguous qualities that I'm working on right now. Good. All right. Takeaway, know thyself, elicit my values, contextually put them in hierarchy order, check ecology. Yes. Thank you, Damon, for the inspirational and truly transformational insights. You are very welcome. Check with perspective of last day of my life. Yeah, that's I found it always very powerful. Can anger internally directed eliminate fear? More precisely, timidity. Can it be considered a resource? So I talked about this before, about how I feel about anger. Anger can be good for waking you up. Anger is good at bringing your attention to a situation that needs to be addressed. Anger is not good to keep around. It's destructive. It's destructive to you mentally and physically. So, like I use the analogy of an alarm clock. If you have an alarm clock next to your bed, and when it goes off, it wakes you up, and then you shut it off. It served its purpose. You're done with it. Imagine though if you let it keep going and you carried it around all day, and people say, "Well, would you shut that thing off? You're awake. You don't need that." And you say, "Well, just in case I fall asleep." That's the equivalent of carrying fear and anger around. So good for waking you up, bad for holding on to it. So, yes, anger, I've gotten angry at times and been able to overcome a fear because I finally fed up. A lot of us, that's what it usually takes. We don't unfortunately, we often let things go until the times that we change is when we're just so completely fed up with something. That's not the best way to do it, but that's the way a lot of people do it. Best way to keep growing and keep advancing and fulfilling your potential is to constantly be working at it just a little bit at a time instead of waiting until, you reach a point where you just can't take something anymore. Big takeaway, listing the various options involved in a choice and doing a values elicitation produces more clarity. Yeah, clarity was what we're really after. Clarity will make the choice obvious. One of the most indecisive people I know, and I have very big decisions to make. So thanks for this. You're welcome. All right. Indecision can be helped by listing values, or not just helped. I mean, that's essential to making good decisions. Got an extra room here in Morocco, but I'm only here for another month or so. Yeah, I won't be there that soon. I took away structure and importance. I have dyslexia. This is really helpful sequences and thinking of out of choices. You're okay, great. I feel I spent too much living for other people to have them in my life, not realizing that I was limiting myself, not staying true to my values. Understanding this means I can change this and have a different outcome. Yeah, I think that's another big part of where people struggle to make decisions between their own values and external values. And so that's why you want to be clear about that as well. If you're clear about your own values, it makes it a lot easier to understand values being imposed on you or just the situation that you're in, like cultural values and societal values. Like I used to think that, yeah, being like super wealthy, flying around in a helicopter and driving fancy cars was like what to aspire to. Now I realize that has so little meaning for me. I wouldn't say no to it if somebody was going to hand it to me, but to work toward it would be a waste of my time because it's not really what I want. There's so many other things that I want. But that cultural societal values saying this is what's important and distracting you from what's really important. Anger has a narcotic effect. I've found a lot of times that anger was covering up sadness. Yeah, did you know that you can actually get addicted to your anger? So yeah, it. Sometimes the only time certain people, if they're not very connected to themselves and to their values and have ways of fulfilling those values, sometimes the only time they really feel alive is when they get angry. And so they get angry often because they're looking for that boost. Okay, let's see. Define and be clear of your values and use those to make decisions. If that still isn't clear enough, imagine the event from the perspective of the end of your life. Okay, good. Questions besides Stoicism, what other philosophies have you studied? The main ones, I would say, well, I studied a lot of Nietzsche when I was actually a teenager. People thought I was really weird because I was the only one in my high school, I think, who knew who Nietzsche was. So I read a lot of his books, and that just kind of put me on a path of I don't think you need like a lot of philosophy. I think you just need to find like a handful of philosophies or that really work for you. So Nietzsche was a good start, and then eventually heavy into non-duality, and then eventually in Stoicism. And you have to be careful with philosophy because it's one of those things you can really get lost in. And there's a lot of philosophy out there that it's more about, I don't know, I found was more about the majority of philosophy, actually, I should say, was more about sort of tickling your brain or making, if you're one of those people who likes to think, and I'm one of those people, and you get fulfillment from just like thinking through complicated philosophical existential topics, uh, you got to be careful with philosophy because I could get totally lost in that, and it wasn't helping me. Like I wasn't getting out there and living my life. It was more contemplation, and so I broke away from philosophy for a long time. I was like, this doesn't work, and then I came back to it when I found NLP. That was the missing piece. Like I needed a model and a map that was experiential and applicable in real life. Whereas a lot of the philosophy that I came across was not. And that's why I became disillusioned with philosophy and even non-duality to a certain extent, because I'd go to my teacher and I'd be like, okay, I think I'm getting this stuff. And he's like, yeah, you're getting it. And I'd be like, but I'm still broke. and I still need to pay my bills, and I still need to support a family." And he's like, "Well, when a lot of this confusion about separation of who you are and all that, once that stuff clears up, it gives you a lot more energy and focus, and you can put onto those things and solve those problems." And I was like, "Okay, well, it's time I need to solve these problems." And that NLP was what I was really needing at that point to solve those problems. However, having a background in good philosophies like Stoicism and non-duality, and a lot of what Nietzsche was teaching, and by the way, a lot of what Nietzsche was teaching actually guided and informed what later became the human potential movement, and then out of that, NLP was born. Uh, so there's a lot of practicality to Nietzsche's philosophies. So just make sure that you don't lose yourself in the philosophy, and you stick to practical things that you can apply in your life, and make sure you're just being engaged in life and very active, and use those philosophies to help you do that. And if the philosophy doesn't help you do that, it's probably useless. Like, so what if you can just like contemplate all these things that don't really have no real effect on our lives? I mean, for fun, sure, go do that, but you can use that to put yourself in between. You can take that stuff and put it in between you and living your life for real, and that's just something you have to be careful of. The end of life thing is in the Bushido code. I didn't know that. I didn't study that. Um, all right. Thank you so much for showing up. I love sharing this stuff, and as you can see, I can just probably talk endlessly about it. But I do need to go, and I look forward to seeing you same place, not the same time tomorrow. There's a different time, but you can check on my YouTube channel. You'll see always the next live that's coming up, what the topic is, and what time it will be happening. So I will be going live again tomorrow. I forget what number we're at right now, but I know we're on the last half of the 30 days. So if you've been here the whole time, keep showing up. It's this information, when you take it in and you use it, will absolutely change your life. All right, I will see all of you tomorrow.